morning. And my name is Catherine Clinton. I'm the Denman Chair of American History at UTSA, where I teach Southern history, women's history, and love to learn about Texas. So thank you for inviting me to this very stimulating talk. I was walking around the exhibit, and it was not a surprise to me that the opening image that we're greeted with is a Georgia O'Keeffe image, a woman artist. And indeed, today we're talking about women artists, and so it's only fitting that she proved the rule of exceptionalism in terms of distribution. I also noticed in the most recent galleries, there was a total of, I was very excited to get a handful of women, 5 of the 38 exhibited. But today I'm sure we'll hear a lot about how and why these things come about. I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Witte Cummins, who's a native of San Antonio. He attended San Antonio Academy, Texas Military Institute, and graduated from Alamo Heights High School. It's a return for him because he participated in Witte Museum summer art camps when he took pottery classes from Harding Black and drawing lessons from Cecilia Steinfeld. He also had a regular contract growing up with Eleanor Onderdonk and Ellen Quillen, both of whom lived in his neighborhood of Laurel Heights, Monte Vista. He holds a PhD in history from Tulane University, specializing in Texas history. He's the Guy M. Bryan Professor Emeritus at Austin College. He's been a Fulbright Scholar. He's now a Minnie Stevens Piper Professor. In 2009, the governor of Texas appointed him as the official historian of the state of Texas, a post he held until 2012. Cummins is the author or editor of 12 books dealing with Texas history, scholarly articles aplenty, best-selling college textbooks, newspaper articles. He's also appeared on radio and television, and we're very grateful that he'll be speaking to us today on women promoting the cause of Texas art. Let's give Dr. Cummins a welcome.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here today to participate in this momentous event marking the 250 years of Texas art and the role that the Witte Museum has played in that fascinating story. I must begin by pointing out, as some of you know, that my wife, Dr. Victoria Cummins, is also a historian and writes about early Texas art. We are two separate people who write individual articles and books, but we do share research. And for that reason, I must note that this presentation today makes use of some of her research, and in most cases, it represents a collaborative research effort. Although I am the person that wrote this presentation, I rely heavily on her and her scholarly acumen. Two other housekeeping matters. I must admit that since this is a historical presentation, some of the images that we are going to see today are from old newspapers and unretouched, unrestored archival photographs, in some cases deteriorated silver nitrate prints, which do not rise to the quality of clarity that we are used to seeing in our modern times. And finally, as a longtime classroom professor of Texas history who taught mostly on Tuesday, Thursdays, I am completely acclimated to speak for 1 hour and 20 minutes without stopping. And so for that reason, my remarks today will be scripted to remain on time. With that, let me say that these women, seen here, the members of the Abilene Women's Forum in the 1920s, are representative of the historical importance that women played in the years prior to World War II as patrons and promoters of Texas art. We would not be here today except for what these women did in encouraging the advancement and advocacy of Texas art. My presentation today is going to deal with 3 important categories in which they participated. First, a group of dedicated, determined women became the first art critics in the state, gathering information about Texas artists, and in some cases, publishing the very first art histories that existed about Texas artists. Second, women led the way in founding art leagues, art organizations, and art museums. The majority of major art museums today in the state of Texas, founded before World War II, can trace their lineage back to what many of these women did. Thirdly and finally, a number of women artists acting as artists prior to World War II also saw art advocacy as an important part of their activities. They, in fact, in addition to their creative endeavors, worked very hard as public representatives of art to advance the cause of art and art education in Texas. So to my first category, early female art critics and commentators. Starting in the early 20th century, a group of dedicated women began compiling information about the start of the art world in Texas as we know it today. The first of these was Minnie Cameron of San Antonio, who sent questionnaires in the early 1920s to Texas artists seeking information about what they were doing in their work. Cameron anticipated publishing a book about early Texas art, which never happened, but today her papers located in the San Antonio Public Library show in many respects the growing vibrancy of Texas art and represent the first documented attempts of anyone to catalog the work of Texas artists. Houstonian Stella Shurtleff also solicited much information about Texas art. She actually wrote a book-length manuscript about Texas artists, which sadly was never published. However, between 1926 and 1935, three women did write full-scale art histories. Goldie Caper-Smith, Frances Battle Fisk, and S.E. Forrest O'Brien all published books about Texas art, and these were the first published art criticism of Texas art. In my opinion, Frances Fisk proved to be the most influential because of her indefatigable work in advancing Texas art in her major book, which we still read today, A History of Texas Art and Artists, which appeared in 1928. We will consider Frances Fisk as our first representative case study of a woman advancing the cause of Texas art. Her volume essentially was the first attempt to classify and systematically survey artists working in the Lone Star State. As Fisk wrote about this overview of Texas art, quote, "There is a real and urgent need for a record in book form dealing exclusively with our painters and sculptors." Fisk's several hundred-page book, and this is a newspaper cartoon of her, examined artistic production in every region of the state, giving specific attention to individual artists. It constitutes the first full-scale history of art in the state, while it provides a snapshot picture of what Texas art looked like in the 1920s. Her book successfully fulfilled its goal, in the process highlighting and promoting artists as important contributors to the Texas cultural experience. She was a native of Georgetown. She married Greenleaf Fisk, the publisher of the Taylor County Times in Abilene. She spent most of her adult life there, writing columns for the newspaper as the women's editor, but she also became an active and dedicated supporter of art activities. As a committed clubwoman and civic leader in Abilene in the 1920s and 1930s, she strenuously advanced the cause of art wherever she could as an important component, she felt, in defining the quality of life. In fact, Fisk was an organizer of the Abilene Women's Club, the Abilene Women's Forum, and importantly, a founder of the Abilene Museum of Fine Arts. If you want to know more about Frances Fisk, I can recommend to you this article, which by my wife and I appears in a book, American Women, Texas Women, published by the University of Georgia Press. To my second category, women founding art museums. Civically active women played significant roles as founders of art associations and museums prior to World War II. These included May Dixon Exall and Sally Griffiths Meyer in Dallas, the Dallas Art Association, which eventually became the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts. In Houston, Emma Richardson Cherry, Florence Fall, the Public School Art League became the Houston Art League, which became the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and across the landscape, other women in towns including Austin, Abilene, Alpine, Beaumont, El Paso, Lubbock, Tyler, Waco, and several others all founded art museums prior to World War II. Ethel Tunstall Drought of San Antonio was one of these women. She is a compelling case study because all of us in this room here today are sitting in these seats because of her early efforts. Ethel Tunstall Drought was born in 1864 in San Antonio. Her husband, Henry P. Drought, was an Irish immigrant to Texas who became one of the most successful attorneys in the Alamo City. H.P. Drought founded his own law firm in the 1880s and became one of South Texas's most prominent attorneys. His firm still exists today. Ethel Drought had a burning commitment to civic betterment throughout her life. She was involved in the burgeoning women's club movement from its very beginnings in the 1880s. In 1892, she founded a reading club for women, which created a lending library, which became the San Antonio Carnegie Public Library, seen there on your right. She served as a charter member of the library board and continued in that post for almost 40 years. She also started a free soup kitchen during the Panic of 1893, which devolved into a municipal health clinic, which became the city's first charity hospital, named for the recently deceased husband of her good friend, Rena Maverick Green. In 1901, the Droughts built a palatial home just northeast of downtown San Antonio in what was then the most prestigious residential section of the city, Brooklyn Heights. That home still stands today. It is the student center of Providence High School, a local school which the Drought family generously supported. Ethel Drought also entertained her many friends from across the country with more extended getaways at a beautiful country estate, Drought Fells, located in the rolling hill country of Texas, some 12 miles south of Comfort, Texas. Ethel spent most summers there and had long periods of extended house guests that made her, in many respects, one of the social arbiters of San Antonio. Drought served, importantly for our purposes, as the main catalyst of the founding of the San Antonio Art League in 1912. She called a meeting held in the Carnegie Public Library on March the 13th of that year to organize an art league for the city. She hoped to found an organization that would promote visual arts in San Antonio. Most of the people that attended were women. Drought became the president of the Art League in 1914, and she continued in that post until 1938. Under her guidance, the San Antonio Art League began sponsoring almost immediately an annual show highlighting Texas artists. And as Kevin Vogel indicated in the previous presentation, it was one of the first such events in Texas to offer juried purchase prizes, which in the early years Mrs. Drought often paid for out of her own pocket. Drought also sought the steady acquisition of art for the Art League, building up a collection of artworks which became eventually the city's first public art gallery. A dedicated art gallery for the League came in 1923 when the Frost National Bank, one of the city's premier banking institutions, opened a then state-of-the-art office tower in downtown San Antonio, a vast improvement, as you can see, over its previous quarters on the same location. The bank made 3 large rooms on the second floor available to the Art League as a public art gallery, largely through the influence of Mrs. Drought on her friend the banker T.C. Frost. Max Kruger, a San Antonio art collector, loaned 10 of his paintings to the project while Ethel Drought prepared to inaugurate the Frost Bank Gallery in June of that year. The success of the Art League's opening exhibit at the Frost Bank occurred at the very same time that another group of San Antonio women were working towards founding a natural science museum that would highlight flora and fauna. Ellen Schultz, eventually Ellen Schultz Quillen, after her marriage, and let me add parenthetically, she was universally known in San Antonio as Mrs. Quillen, so I will refer to her as that anachronistically, although at this time she was still Ellen Schultz, had learned as a high school science teacher about the existence of a natural history collection in Houston by the collector A.P. Atwater, which was for sale. Mrs. Quillen organized a group of San Antonio women to purchase that collection, and once it was purchased, they then turned towards the project of building a natural science museum which would house the Atwater collection. The new museum group found powerful allies in 2 men in the person of San Antonio Mayor John Tobin, who enlisted the assistance of the San Antonio Parks Commissioner Ray Lambert, and the 2 of them secured funding from the San Antonio City Council for the construction of this new science museum, which was to be placed in San Pedro Park. If you know the San Pedro Park branch library, that was the very spot that was anticipated. The architectural firm of Ayers and Ayers agreed to donate its services to design the new building, and as plans went forward, Atlee Ayers recommended that the building be built as a 1-story building with the stipulation that at some point in the future a 2nd story could be added. It was at this juncture that the Witte Memorial Museum took shape. Ethel Drought and the San Antonio Art League proposed to Mrs. Quillen that the Art League and the Science Group go into league and join together to found a joint museum. Drought suggested that the anticipated 2nd story go ahead and be added to the new building, and that 2nd floor would be the art gallery. Additional plans for the museum accelerated in September of 1925 when San Antonio businessman Alfred G. Witte passed away. He left a bequest to the city of San Antonio, some $85,000 in total, to be added to the city council funds for the new museum, along with $10,000 for the purchase of paintings, which was immediately accepted. Witte stipulated, however, that the new museum should be built in Breckenridge Park, then located on the very northern edge of San Antonio on a street called at that time River Avenue, today Broadway. Construction went forward quickly with the combined science and art museum. The Witte Museum finally opened to the public on October the 8th, 1926, during a day of festivities. Mrs. Quillen became the director of the museum, but Mrs. Drought and the Art League had complete and total control of the 2nd floor art gallery. And here we see Mrs. Drought welcoming visitors to the Art League gallery on opening day. Within a year of the opening of the art gallery at the Witte, Mrs. Drought hired a person as the first full-time curator who was well known to her at the time and well known to all of us here today because we've already heard much about her. Eleanor Rogers Onderdonk, the daughter of Robert Onderdonk and the sister of the recently deceased Julian Onderdonk. As we've already heard from Amy Fulkerson and from Kevin Vogel, most recently today, Eleanor Onderdonk eventually became one of the Southwest's most influential art curators. Drought and Onderdonk very quickly became involved in something that anyone that knows about Texas art history recognizes as one of the most seminal events in the history of the development of Texas art. The famous wildflower competitions of 1927, 1928, and 1929, underwritten by the Luling oil man Edgar B. Davis. Mr. Davis was a personal friend of the Droughts. H.P. was his attorney. Davis approached Mrs. Drought with the idea of sponsoring this competition, and so it was Miss Drought who became the moving force, administrator, and prime motivator, in fact, of the Davis wildflower competitions. And in fact, they emerged, as we all know, and if you don't, you can certainly take a look at William E. Reeves' fine book on A Wildcatter's Dream, to create what was one of the true seminal, in fact, events of Texas art. Kenneth Ragsdale, when he wrote about the Texas Centennial of 1936, a history book, said that the Texas Centennial was the year that the world discovered Texas. I would argue that the Davis wildflower competitions were the events in which Texas discovered it had an art. And Mrs. Drought was behind every moment and every effort to put that on. Soon after the closing of the Davis wildflower competitions, Ethel Drought secured an additional place for the Witte Museum and the Art League in the regional art community when she invited the Southern States Art League to hold its annual meeting at the Witte. She spared no personal expense in bringing the Southern Art League to San Antonio, because this was at the time the most important regional art group to which Texas art and artists would have access. She planned a sterling weekend. After a luncheon at the Menger Hotel, delegates attended sessions much like we're doing right here today. Then they toured an art gallery on the second floor composed of almost 300 works by various of its members. Drought, in something I'm glad Maurice McDermott has not tried to duplicate, in a considerable social undertaking, invited all 600 delegates to her home for a reception that evening. And then the next day, Drought treated, at her expense, the entire 600 people to a gala luncheon for the delegates at the original Mexican restaurant, an iconic Alamo City eatery on La Soya Street. Many of those in attendance had, from elsewhere in the South, never seen Mexican food because it was not yet then as pervasive as it is today. So Mrs. Drought delighted that luncheon, moving from table to table, instructing many of them on how to roll tortillas, dip salsa with tostadas, and explaining the makeup of exotic dishes such as chili, enchiladas, and tacos. Drought continued her work in support, Drought continued her support of the visual arts all through the 1930s in a variety of ways. During most of the Depression decade, she committed to sponsoring an art exhibition, especially on Texas, invite speakers to the meetings of the Art League, and never missed an opportunity to advance Texas art, and especially during the Texas Centennial of 1936. But by the early 1940s, her health had begun to fade. She died on October the 6th, 1943. By the time of her passing, Ethel Drought had become one of the best known and respected women in San Antonio. But nevertheless, what's important for us to realize now is that there were other major cities in Texas that also had their equivalents of Ethel Drought, although in some of the smaller towns they probably worked on a much smaller scale than Mrs. Drought did here in San Antonio. If you want to know more about Ethel Drought, I recommend to you one of the best written articles I have ever seen that significantly, I think, does in fact flesh out much of what I said here today. It's in the book Texan Identities, published by the University of North Texas Press. And to my third and final topic, women, female artists, stood before the public in the years before World War II as advocates and art educators, advancing the cause of Texas beyond and above their own artwork. They played significant roles in these activities prior to World War II, going far beyond their creative activities to become vocal and untiring advocates for the cause of art in Texas and to increase public awareness. The list can go on and on. A.M. Carpenter, Emma Richardson Cherry, Grace Spalding John, Eveline Sellers, and literally the entire studio art department of the College of Industrial Arts, Texas State College for Women, now Texas Women's University. In fact, the art department at what is now TWU in these years constituted, in my opinion, the Harvard, Yale, and Princeton all rolled into one of female art education in Texas. I think we have a TWU trustee in the room. I said that specifically for her. At any rate, also, one can point to a well-known figure here in San Antonio as a female arts advocate, Waldine Tauch. And let me say here parenthetically, it was my good fortune, as many of you in this room knew, to know this fine artist personally, and she always pronounced her name Tauch, which is the German word for shark. But now today in the art world, many people pronounce it as Tausch, and I guess there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, I know for a fact that Dr. Tau often had her name mispronounced to her, and she was always gracious enough to never say anything about it. But at any rate, she was an advocate for Texas art, and as many in San Antonio know, a protege of Pompeo Capini. She operated for many decades an art academy, which even today still bears his name. I wish to highlight as a case study Allie Victoria Tennant, a Dallas sculptor active from World War I to the 1960s as a representative case study of a woman advancing Texas art beyond her own creative activities. She is best known for the heroic art that she produced during the Texas Centennial, the Gilded Tejas Warrior, and sculptures of James Butler Bonham and Jose Antonio Navarro. Let me add that we are most fortunate today, since most of her work is in private hands, our heroic size, to have in the exposition a scaled-down version of Allie Tennant's Tejas Warrior, which was done by her for Anna Hyatt Huntington and put at the Brook Green Gardens in 1938. It's there in this room just to my right, and this is the first time that Tejas Warrior has left Brook Green Gardens since it arrived there in 1938. Allie Tennant worked tirelessly to advance the appreciation of arts in Texas in a wide variety of forums. She taught evening art classes in the Dallas Public Schools. She helped, as we'll see in a second, develop the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts. She taught at the Dallas Art Institute. She regularly, on a weekly basis, made presentations to church youth groups, to talk to civic clubs, women's organizations, museum tours, and often on the radio, having a program for many years on WFAA. She wrote newspaper articles and made newspaper commentary about important artists and exhibitions. Her most important activity in that regard was Allie Tennant served on the Board of Trustees of the Dallas Art Association from 1943 to 1969. That is the group, in a complicated legal arrangement, which administered for many years the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, which was the forerunner of today's Museum of Fine Arts, in which my esteemed panel colleague today, Sue Castleberry, is a curator of American art. Tennant shaped the early collections of the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts in significant ways, serving for almost 30 years on the acquisitions committee. In fact, in my opinion today, even today, a good bit of the original permanent collection of the Dallas Museum of Arts reflects Allie Tennant's artistic sensibilities. And so for that reason, essentially, Allie Tennant was and should remain a significant and very, very important purveyor, an example of what we look for in a woman advancing the cause of Texas art as an artist. And if you want to know Allie Tennant's second great significant contribution, let me say she became a significant proponent of regionalism. a school of artistic and intellectual orientation that grew up in the late 1920s and 30s. Admittedly, most of the regionalists were men. There were a number of them were women, and chief among them, of course, was Allie Tennant, who tirelessly advocated regionalism, wrote about it, and found herself at the center of a community of intellectuals, writers, authors, journalists, all of whom were advancing the cause of Texas regionalism. If you want to, talking about well-written things, if you want to know more about Allie Tennant, there's a book that's even more well-written than the Ethel Drought Tunstall article, and that is, of course, my book on Allie Tennant, which, since Michael Grauer had the temerity to mention his book was on sale out there, well, maybe you can get a 2-for-1 and get mine along with it. The net takeaway from all of this is that Texas women in the years prior to World War II, as art critics, as art association founders and museum founders, and as artists advancing the cause of Texas art beyond their own creative endeavors, created in many respects the foundations of the world of Texas art that we know today. Which brings me to the subtitle of what promises to be, I think, a good book, currently under contract with the Texas A&M University Press, sponsored by Cassetta. It is a book of readings, and as I look around the room, I see a good half dozen of the authors of various chapters in that book. It will be a book devoted completely and solely to assessing the role of women artists in Texas, both as art patrons, but also as artists as well, from the 1860s to the 1960s, and we hope to have that published in 2020. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our next speaker, because back when Light and I met up in graduate school, but when I took art history, the course I remember most was Anonymous was a woman, and we were in the business of recovery. So I'm so pleased to introduce our speaker today, Sue Canterbury, who's the Pauline Gill Sullivan Associate Curator of American Art at the Dallas Museum of Art and curator of the exhibition Ida O'Keeffe, Escaping Georgia's Shadow. Before joining the DMA, she served as associate curator at the Department of Paintings at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. She holds her MA and BA in art history from Williams College and Wellesley College, respectively. Her other recent exhibitions include Alexander Hogue, the Erosion Series, 2014, Edward Steichen, In Exaltation of Flowers, 2018, and Cult of the Machine, Precision and American Art in 2018. Let's welcome Sue Canterbury.
Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Witte Museum for inviting me to speak about a subject that's very dear to me, but it's been very close to me for quite a few years. I spent 4.5 years doing research on this exhibition, and that might even be a low estimate there. But anyway, I'll just launch, and let's see here. There we go. Yes, untimely ambitions and obstacles unforeseen. Georgia O'Keeffe looms over American art of the 20th century, and her fame subsumes all who traveled within her orbit. Because she outlived everyone, her family, her friends, she shaped her history and their roles in it without fear of challenge. She did such with her younger sister, Ida Tennant O'Keeffe, whose artistic talent was sufficiently threatening to compel Georgia to malign her sister's gifts for posterity by portraying her as a minor talent unworthy of serious consideration. My research for the exhibition, Ida O'Keeffe, Escaping Georgia's Shadow, revealed much that was contrary to George's story. That was not how it had always been. Separated by 2 years of age, the sisters had been close growing up and continued to find great comfort in one another's company up into the early 1930s. Ida, outgoing and affable, was the extrovert to George's introversion. Georgia often referred to Ida as my nice sister, or the nicest girl I've ever known. From the earliest art lessons in Wisconsin was Sarah Mann at upper left, and that was a time when the family thought Ida possessed the greater artistic talent, to the classrooms of Chatham Episcopal Institute, today Chatham Hall, with Elizabeth Willis, second from the left, and then to the University of Virginia summer sessions in Charlottesville, where they both studied with Alon Beament, and then finally to the Teachers College at Columbia University, where both studied, though 15 years apart, both studied with Charles James Martin. In the 1910s, both sisters taught at a succession of schools in the South. And in 1918, both sisters arrived in New York City, Georgia being brought there from her teaching position in Canyon, Texas by Alfred Stieglitz, and Ida entering the 3-year nursing program at Mount Sinai Hospital. During the 1920s, Ida became a frequent visitor to the Stieglitz family compound at Lake George, which was simply known as the Hill. She had become like family with the Stieglitz family and that ring of circle of the artists that were around Stieglitz at that period in time. And in the fall of 1924, she came for a particularly long stay of 2.5 months, stretching from early September to mid-November. And during this time, there was a sense of playfulness that settled on not only the host, but also the guests that visited at the Hill. And Ida said that they had all been bitten by the magic bug. Stieglitz himself, he abandoned serious photography, and he confessed to a friend that he was taking foolish snaps, something that he rarely did. Stieglitz tried to persuade Ida to pose for him in the nude, or to let him immortalize her back at the very least, something that she never would allow. And the dress you see slipped off of her shoulder here is probably as much skin as ever that Stieglitz ever succeeded in seeing of Ida, beyond the usual, her legs or her neck, etc. Stieglitz also flirted with Ida shamelessly. And mind you, this is just about a couple months before he marries Georgia O'Keeffe in December of 1924. And he would write notes to her that he would slip under her door for her to find when she would arise in the morning. And one morning, he left this photo, crow's feather and apple. Now, for some background, the grounds around the house on the hill were basically, they were full of apple trees of all various varieties. And at that time in the early 20s, there was a variety known as the Ida Red. And thus, during her visit, Stieglitz would refer to Ida as Red Apple or Little Red Apple. And he also began identifying himself as the Old Crow's Feather. In case Ida might miss the point, no pun intended, he attached this note, which left no doubt as to its meaning. But there is Old Crow's Feather, ever jabbed into the reddest of round red apples. Stieglitz definitely created a great deal of smoke that fall, but Ida never let it develop into a fire. And beyond the juvenilia of her 3 years at Chatham Hall in the early 1900s, no works by Ida survive from her years of teaching in Virginia in the 1910s. Her earliest works in oil emerged from basically a time she spent in Connecticut on a private nursing duty gig of about 6 months duration. Inspired by the grounds around her, it was a 1,000-acre estate this fellow owned, and she would wander all over it, down to the marshes, through the woods. There were wildflowers, but also cultivated gardens, and she loved the beauty of it. But She also spent a lot of time in the library where she encountered the works of James McNeill Whistler and books also written about him, biographies. And so she also started expressing that she really wanted to start painting. She wanted to do something with her time, you know, between administering pills and shots. And so she decided that she was going to start painting. But this is where I was, I guess as the Brits would say, I was gobsmacked, because when I'm reading through her correspondence to Stieglitz, it became clear to me that even though she had studied art, and even though she had taught art all during the teens, she had never studied oil painting. And she would write to Stieglitz saying, you know, I've never done this before, or I hope to take lessons, etc., from the artist across the road who's staying here this summer. But this discovery of her not having painted before led me down this sort of rabbit hole. I was constantly finding new rabbit holes to dive down as I went through this story. And it led me to look at the state of arts education for women at this period of time. And basically, young girls were taught to draw, to do watercolors, and it was basically seen as part of their finishing, to make them a good wife and mother that would create one day an aesthetically pleasing home. Oil painting, on the other hand, was considered to be serious, reserved for professionals, and those professionals were generally assumed to be men. And the exceptions to that generally might be an individual of wealth. Think of someone like Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, who had the means that they could take all the courses they wanted, do all the painting they wanted without any sort of societal backlash. Or it would also be women who might have sat in on co-ed classes. Since men were present, oil was sure to be taught at this period. And such was the case for Georgia, because she had attended co-ed classes at the Art Institute of Chicago School, and also in New York just before, around the beginning of World War I. However, Georgia was not comfortable with the medium. When Stieglitz fell in love with her charcoal drawings and her watercolors in 1916, and then brought her to New York in 1918, one of the first things he said to her was, you have to start painting in oils. And it's interesting that introductory oil painting in there is 1918. But he told her, he says, otherwise no one will take you seriously. So as a novice to the medium of oil, Ida progressed by trial and error, not only there in Norfolk, Connecticut, but once she returned to New York, and she kept plugging away at it. And, but the thing, she persisted, and she made quick progress, and by 1926, Stieglitz wrote to a friend that her work showed incredible talent. And in late 1927, whoops, I should have had that up before, but in late 1927, she was included in an exhibition curated by Georgia for the Opportunity Gallery in New York. It was fairly new, and it always had guest curators. And so Georgia did include Ida in this, and you'll see also the name of Helen Torr below, who was the wife of Arthur Dove. And Ida had 5 things within that exhibition. And what becomes apparent that in some of those works, that Whistler's sway on Ida was still quite profound. And looking at the work at the upper left, called Figures by an Ocean, York, Maine, from 1927, it is undeniably indebted to Whistler's contemplative works he referred to with the musical name of Notes. Here, she adopted the same abbreviated treatment, breaking the monochromatic image into 3 horizontal bands suggesting beach, water, and sky. The high key red on the little beachcombers at the shore essentially were a real departure from Whistler's aesthetics of understatement. Another work, which was one of the 5 she exhibited at the Opportunity Gallery, is Still Life from 1926. The work possesses naive charm, and as well, it reveals a debt to Whistler in the construction of space, and clearly follows his arrangement in gray and black Portrait of the Artist's Mother, #1. And I took the liberty here of turning it on the side so you can see that sort of comparison of how she's breaking that space. And The location of the motif from which the painting draws was revealed while I was reviewing some images, unfixed photographs that were at the Beinecke Library at Yale. And essentially they were brown, very deep. They'd never gone through the final fixing bath by Stieglitz. And so we paid them to digitize the works, and they sent us the images, and I changed it to grayscale so it doesn't basically burn your eyes out, because it's a really acrid, bright, orangey brown. But one of the things you see here is that this little vase here appears on the side of this. Essentially what this was the trim that goes around this mirrored window, which is on the outside, on the porch at Lake George. And this painting can also be solidly dated. I mean, the photograph can be solidly dated to 1924 because of the presence of Stieglitz's infamous little still life of crow's feather and apple sitting on that lower shelf. Okay. The positive critical response Ida received during the run of the show at the Opportunity Gallery compelled her to pursue formal training, and in the fall of 1929, she entered the Teachers College of Columbia University. And she attended for both her BS and her master's and got that in 5 years, graduating by 32. This application was a treasure trove because it revealed where she had attended schools, but also where she had taught in the teens in the state of Virginia. But the experience at Columbia was transformative for her, and that was particularly because of the tutelage of Charles James Martin, with whom Georgia also studied in 1914. A particular note within this forum here today, Charles Martin also had a profound effect on several women from Texas who studied at the Teachers College, including Edith Brezac, Velma Davis Dozier, Lucille Land Lacey, Thetis Lemon, Barbara Maples, and Corinne Mary Spellman. Martin emphasized essence and interpretation over sheer representation, and he helped Ida, as he had helped Georgia, to adopt dynamic and abstracted interpretations of visual phenomena. Martin's approach to composition was geared towards creating a sense of movement through an effective placement of line and form, and it is clear in this watercolor how it relies on the diagonals to move you around the edge of the canvas. He was also noted for using the white of paper as a structural element within the work. And these two works by Ida sort of show how she applied his theories. The watercolor at top is her initial impression of the scene on Cape Cod in the summer '31. Below, back in the studio, where she reorganizes and sharpens angles, increases the diagonal thrust of all the various lines to carry around the composition. The discovery of film housed at the Pacific Film Archives at UC Berkeley revealed the methodology by which Martin trained Ida and his other students. Titled Creative Design and Painting was the name of his course at Columbia, and he demonstrated the use of different types of line within a series of rectangles. And basically, essentially, upper left, verticals and horizontals, upper right, then he would use sheerly diagonal lines. At lower left, use of arcing forms only in nesting and also overlapping. And then finally, in the fourth at lower right, he brings all three together in one composition. And these, Ida would employ all three of these type of lines in one arrangement or other within her key series known as a Highland Light series, done in 1931-32, which we bring together here in a sweep. There was really 7 to the series, the first of which was realistically portrayed. That one is now lost, but the rest were done starting in basically 3 colors: white, black, and ultramarine blue, and each became increasingly abstracted, and also she would introduce new colors along the way. And Lighthouse number 2, this is what started the whole exhibition. I encountered this in a collection in Dallas. It was across the room. I looked at it and I thought, who is that by? It reminds me of Arthur Dove, but I know it's not Arthur Dove. And that's when I went across and asked the owner, because it's not signed on the front, and she told me it was by George's younger sister, and that's when my mouth fell open. And so that was the start of the whole thing. Lighthouse number 3, also known descriptively as Seagull with Snow Effect, and this one is lighter than the other compositions, but she's making heavy use of arcs within this particular one here, arcing here, arcs in here. There's arcs everywhere through this work. And then number 4, again, the use of arcs. The light beams are now going straight, angular, bending around. And then number 5, again, a heavy use of the arced line through here to move you around. The light's not emanating from this abstracted lighthouse, but it comes down and creates the mast on this little boat here that's situated at the lower right. And the sort of the outlier to the whole series was this one done in white, black, and red, which is obviously relying only on horizontal, verticals, and diagonals, no circles. And this one also had on the back of it her integer calculations for using dynamic symmetry, as well as her mapping out one of the other compositions there. And and finally, the last number 7 is using all 3 types of lines running through it, the horizontal and verticals. The thing that's really interesting, though, her use of dynamic symmetry, I had my intern basically map out using software from online to show how she was using dynamic symmetry based on the Fibonacci sequence of mathematics to create the golden mean. This whole thing was a very popular type of method at that period in time. Many artists were doing it. It was promoted by this fellow named Jay Hambidge. And Ida learned this from Martin as well. And we see only one Fibonacci running here. And these lines will follow usually close to the form, these arcs of these lines. You see it embracing them. And again, as done over here, coming around, embracing that arc as well. And just to bring forward that Ida, the influence, some of the influences are sort of apparent that one can pick up on here, is that she was looking at some artists of the Stieglitz circle with whom, she would socialize, who she knew quite well, would see their exhibitions at Stieglitz's gallery, but particularly that being Charles Demuth, My Egypt in 1927, but which was exhibited in 1930 at Stieglitz's gallery, which she would have seen, and the similarities, his lines of force used here, where Ida here is adopting a similar thing here in the use of her lighthouse, but that also comes forward here within this work as well. And then another work, Toadstool, done immediately after her graduation. She was in Tennessee looking for a teaching position, but she did this wonderful little work of nesting ovals. And I remember thinking originally that, that reminds me of Georgia, and then I became to realize it was really more Arthur Dove again that I was looking at. And we have there multiple examples of how Arthur Dove would apply these very organic forms within his work, this sort of spiritual type of feeling, using these wonderful natural forms, nesting in one another. And so Ida would continue to do a few other works, such as Royal Oak of Tennessee, and this wonderful Roses on the left, a painting which has not been located, and another on the right, Duck Totem Pipe, during that summer. And all those works with the lighthouses would debut in her first solo show in New York City at the Delphic Studios in March of 1933. The previous month, Catherine O'Keeffe Clennert, who was also painting, had also exhibited at the Delphic Studios. And Georgia was becoming quite alarmed with the encroachment of her sisters on what she saw as her turf. And she wrote a very terse letter to her sister Catherine, who was also doing large flowers, by the way. But she wrote to her saying that, "I'm going to come tear your pictures to pieces." They did not speak for 5 years. She demanded that they stop exhibiting. Catherine gave up painting altogether. Ida refused, and it's at that point that Ida and Georgia became estranged and remained so for the rest of their lives. Ida O'Keeffe launched her career as an artist against the backdrop of the Great Depression. Single and therefore self-supporting, she found it necessary to supplement her income in order to survive. She performed research for an educational company, wrote short stories, and as well a third-grade reader, Forest Indians here, which we see, which was issued in 2 editions. And she also did a mural project under the Works Progress Administration for the New York Public Library. But focusing fully on her work was a luxury that she would never have. She also developed a specialty in the monotype, and throughout the 1930s, they were a constant feature in her exhibitions, and they garnered considerable attention in reviews for the sensitivity and nuanced expression, as is witnessed in works such as Evening and this one, Before Morn. In 1937, Ida returned to the Delphic Studios for another solo show, but this time of her monotypes only. And you see the program at upper left. And in that same year, she also authored an article on the monotype for the Prince Journal and shared some of her tricks as well as advice for artists lacking a printing press, which was generally her situation. She instructed them to either use a clothes wringer to put the plate and the print through, just use a clothes wringer on your old washing machine, crank it through, or do as she did, an electric iron. So essentially, have iron wheel travel because Ida moved around a lot. And on many levels, a monotype process was a perfect medium for her. Given her itinerant lifestyle, she was often without a studio, and many of the schools at which she taught did not have a printing press. The process did not use acids. The size of the matrix or the plate was small in scale, and further, the black and white medium was also well suited to working under not the best lighting conditions when she would come home from a day of work, either nursing or teaching art. And in the fall of 1934, Ida O'Keeffe accepted the first in a succession of temporary teaching positions, requiring her repeated relocation across the East Coast, the Midwest, and the South, a scenario that mirrored George's own situation before being brought to New York by Alfred Stieglitz in 1918. Everywhere Ida went, her arrival was heralded in the local press, but always with her connection to George and Stieglitz being of key interest. And in the case of this clipping, announcing her arrival in San Antonio, and I apologize for the quality of it, in September 1938, she was clearly eclipsed by her sister Georgia, and the title says, Artist Sister Joins Lady of Lake Faculty. And so not even her own name there in that sense. So, so that was something that really followed her everywhere she went. And she spent nearly a full year here in San Antonio at the college from September 2nd until August of 1939, and her course load was heavy. During the days, she taught art history courses, but also 2 painting courses, each with a 4-hour lab. In the evenings, she was conducting painting classes for people from the community. And in addition, the home ec department basically was being reaccredited that year and asked her to teach a course on textiles. So she was full up. And in spite of the fact that Ida was constantly beginning anew with each move, she always managed to create her own community wherever she went by jumping in and affiliating herself with people of like interest. And she was elected as a member of the new Mary Bonner Graphic Arts Club and exhibited some etchings in the club's inaugural exhibition in October of 1938. She also exhibited her monotypes in a solo show here at the Witte Museum in that same month. Somehow she managed to squeeze in time to create works such as this, Stargazing in Texas. This is a work that the DMA acquired in September of 2017, and in which this young woman, surrounded by an expansive landscape stretching to the horizon, looks up to contemplate the stars, not in the picture, but on the frame. And those cut-out 10 stars are what Ida herself put on the frame. So ultimately, the demands of these teaching positions meant that she didn't have time to concentrate on her own work. And as she moved through the 30s, she seemed to be dabbling between styles. And exhibitions would have things alongside, such as tulips, a still life, alongside full on abstractions such as Creation from 1936, and also this work called Whirl of Life from 1936. And this frustrated critics who were accustomed to seeing artists with a more focused body of work. And one of them even commented, it seems that she is working in two directions at once. And so after moving 13 times in 10 years, Ida's nomadic existence came to an end. Oh, sorry, and go back to that. Oh, I missed that, sorry. And this is a work after leaving San Antonio, she would go on to Cuba, which she did this work, Young Banana Plant from 1939, which is, you'll notice in the, well, it's in the Chitty's collection. I think that everybody pretty much so knows that. And so then after that, she moved to Whitte, California in 1943 about. And basically, she would become a respected member of this community. And her style of painting would become very realistic, and works such as this Young Banana Plant. Yes, okay. And so essentially, in the last year of her life, here we have, as if, here she is, shown here with some of her works. And coming just as a wrap up here, Georgia, as if suffering from amnesia, seemingly had forgotten that her own struggles and desperation while teaching at Canyon, where she foresaw a future filled with a endless string of teaching positions. Stieglitz had made it possible for Georgia to devote herself without interruption to development of her own work. Further, he endlessly promoted her and gave her a solo show every year, meanwhile developing her brand and introducing her and her art to the key critics and the best clients. She spent the latter part of her career, however, trying to overturn the perception that Stieglitz had made her, and that instead her rise to success was owing to her talent alone. And essentially, almost there. And so Georgia also chose to ignore her own culpability in obstructing Ida's progress and forbidding Stieglitz to show Ida's work, as well as Catherine's, and eventually also persuading Stieglitz to work against Ida's best interests, in that he actively engaged in bullying other New York galleries into not showing Ida's work. Persuading one owner to cancel Ida's upcoming show, he said, "We all know there's only one O'Keeffe, and that's Georgia. Let's not have another." So, ironically, for all of her involvement in undermining her sister, Georgia mused months after Ida's death in 1961 that Ida's was, in some odd way, a wasted life. In the ensuing years, when Georgia's biographers inquired about the other sisters who painted, Georgia would reply, the real talent had been Anita, the sister who had never painted or exhibited. This clearly an effort to dismiss any threat that Ida or Catherine had ever posed to her. And Claudia, the youngest sister, who always felt Ida never got her due, would have the full brunt of Georgia's fury come down on her when she arranged a show of Ida's work in Santa Fe in 1974, Georgia's own backyard. Ida O'Keeffe was undoubtedly talented. Her Lighthouse series represent a high point at which she was posed for greater things to come. Had she had encouragement and financial backing at that crucial point, remember earlier today we're talking about backing artists so they can paint. If she'd had that, and having that stability of living and being able to concentrate on the work, I do feel that we would be telling a very different story today. And the thing is that she had obstruction from the sector in which she at least expected it would come, from the people who were closest to her, but also the people who wielded extraordinary power in the art world. Her rediscovery of her and her work not only adds an unknown talent to the canon of art history, but her story also serves to remind us that artists don't particularly become famous because they were so much better than their contemporaries, but rather because they had a lucky break. Art history is littered with the ambitions of many talented artists who never got their lucky break. And Ida O'Keeffe is emblematic of the majority of creative, talented women who dared to dream, but for whom there were no advocates. Thank you.
And I regret very much we don't have time for questions, but I know that we all will want to thank our speakers for giving us much to question and think about, especially as we view this wonderful exhibit. Thank you.